I just remember when I was in my lowest moments, I would tell God, remember my prayers when I was strong, when my faith was in full force, and don't count those at my lowest.
Welcome to She Leads, a podcast about leadership, faith, and relationships from a woman's perspective. I'm your host, Thea, and I'm so glad that you joined in today. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. I invite you to continue to send your feedback, your comments, and your questions to sheleadscomments@gmail.com. Get to read them right here, and like I said, have you be a part of the conversation. Today, I'm excited to welcome back my friend Susie, Pastor Susie, who is serving out at Christ Church Sugar Land. Would you reintroduce yourself and then tell us something that you're consuming right now? Who are you a fan of? What are you taking in?
Yes, Susie Puac. I serve as pastor to children and families, Christ Church Sugar Land. And, over the last year, I want to say, and during seminary, I was introduced to Richard Rohr. Mm. And so I've really honed into his ministry for the self and the meditation and finding myself. So I do listen to his podcast and read some of his books.
Yeah, I love his description of the breath sounding like Yahweh, and how that this is the first name of God, and it's actually just the sound of our own breath in. Right. And I think that's tremendous. I have yes and on my my Bible time area on my stand, and so I pick that up every now and then. It's just a little daily, just a couple paragraphs, meditation and thoughts, and it's really, really good too. So I'm also a big fan of Richard Rohr. So today we're going to talk a little bit about just how you take care of yourself, where you feel like God is leading you into new dreams and new realities. And so as a leader, I think it's important to also think about how are you leading yourself? So not just your work setting, your work teams, your volunteers, even your families that you serve, but how are you leading Susie? How are you taking care of yourself?
One of the first things when I felt called into ministry, in my prayers, I said, okay, God, if this is what you're calling me into, I need balance. I grew up in a family of church planters. So we were the kids to sleep in the pews, and we were the kids at church 4 or 5 times a week. And we were also the kids that heard the conversations the adult leaders were having, and they weren't always fruitful, right? And so I never intended to work in a church. And as a matter of fact, what I would say is, I will serve God free and willing, but I will never work in a church. And of course, the never always gets you. And so that's why when I felt the call to ministry, I was like, I need balance, God, because I've seen too much, I know too much, and it's ugly. And so I think that there was that intentionality of it, but I also do believe God's grace in terms of bringing the right people in my path, whether it was through friendships or ministry that helped me understand what that path was. And part of that, let me also say, is the whole seminary trajectory. Because the United Methodist Church does have processes in place to help clergy understand the significance of that self-care, whether it's through spiritual habits or professional help. And so maybe I came in with that thought of what does this balance look like so it doesn't overtake my life, but then also having the understanding and the knowledge of, okay, but what does it actually look like when I say this? Yeah. Where do I get this help? And so one of the first things I did early on was counseling for myself, which is something I continue to do, and discovering, okay, what are those things that hold me back for me. And seminary and my call really has been that call to myself to understand who I am. And so that triggers into definitely the prayer and the meditation. I'm such a huge advocate for that because I have seen how it works. And initially, I'm more of an introvert. So I do enjoy the quiet spaces and being alone in my thoughts. But there's a different element when you're doing that for self-care and you're being intentional about it. And it's not just something natural that you do because you enjoy it. And so last year, I went through a very, very difficult health situation. And had I not had those practices of spiritual meditation and prayer in place, I don't know how I would have survived. And I just remember when I was in my lowest moments, I would tell God, remember my prayers when I was strong, when my faith was in full force, and don't count those at my lowest. And so that's what I think why I'm such a huge proponent to it, because it not only prepares us going into situations or our daily life, it carries us through those situations and then the aftermath as well. And so it just becomes part of your daily nutrition. Like there's no way I could sustain and function, especially being called to ministry and tackling with different personalities and priorities that are thrown. We know that, clergy is one of the most difficult career paths, and it really takes a lot. And so my desire is to continue to hone into the spiritual practice of prayer and meditation. Then through my health, I have taken on physical exercise. And I've never been a person to exercise. I've always enjoyed nature trails and walks. And again, it's kind of like that because I love it and I do it. But once I realized how connected our spiritual self is to our body and our thinking, I really just took it in. And I am one that I started practicing yoga, and when I am in certain postures and I'm praying through them, it's like my whole body is activated, and I'm surrendering not to nothingness. I'm surrendering to God, and He is infiltrating every piece of me, every muscle, every tissue. And so even going back to that breath, that's why I love Richard Rohr so much, because of that breath. And so because of those spiritual practices, in a moment of tense or anxiety, you can easily go into those breath exercises to recenter and regain and really acknowledge God's presence in that moment. And then you lose yourself, but not to nothing. You lose yourself to God. And so those have been key for me. So the exercise, and then one of the graces I learned in seminary was drinking water. Yeah. And because I was not a big water drinker.
What a novel idea.
Right? But when you give it that element of, there is life in this water and what it's doing, and it's a grace, then I could take it and say, oh my gosh, how could I do without this? Yeah. And so that goes into the nutrition as well. Yeah. I remember we did a class with my spiritual director, and it was, I don't know if you ever did it. She had us, we were doing classes at St. Paul at that time, and we went outside and had a sandwich. And she invited us to eat our lunch, but to take every element of the meal and give it up to God and just really meditate on it, whether that meditation took you to where that lettuce was grown, the hands that it went through. And it made such an impact in my life, not only for what I was putting into my body, but also everything that is at work, from God to the laborers. And so it really made me stop and think, that's not really nourishing my body. And then it carries on to my actions. Is that beneficial? Because we start to see how connected we really are.
Yeah. I love that, that reminder to kind of just be intentional and present with your breath, with nature, and even with the food and drinks that we're consuming, to really be present in those moments. And how I can just think about how in ministry, sometimes I have to remind myself, the best thing I can do today is really be present, right where I am. And I've shared before that when I have left churches, it's not a lot of thanks and congratulations for all I've accomplished. Not that I didn't accomplish a lot, but the overwhelming thank you is for my presence. Thank you for being there. Thank you for talking with me. Thank you for listening. And it makes me just that kind of think too, that there's often that I believe God is also just requesting our presence and our recognition of God's presence with us, and how, man, it's so easy just to push past that and not think about that. You'd mentioned, in seminary and counseling, and even, Richard Rohr and his great advice. Do you have any current leaders in your life that you're following? Are you finding a space for that? I know sometimes when we're the leaders, we forget to find leaders. Are you able to make that space? And if not, where are you looking for it?
I think that is still a work in progress for me, especially coming out of seminary. I've been engulfed with books, and then now in preparation for commissioning, trying to get that. So I don't know that I have found my sweet spot. I do know that I love, I met Professor Jamie Clark Souls, and just what she deposits into her knowledge as a professor. So I definitely follow her and what she's doing. Of course, Renee Brown. And I can't think of she's a very famous author, and I can't think of her name right now, but she went through cancer, and she kind of writes about all of that. And so having experienced cancer, that has been a pivotal moment for me in terms of like, okay, what does all this mean for me right now?
Yeah. You mentioned your health recovery, and now also you're in a new position you started this summer. What other new things are you looking forward to, and where are you finding a space to kind of dream about some new possibilities?
Honestly, I feel like I'm just right now in the present, because going into my calling, of course I knew I was going to go into a pastoral role, but the last 4 years have been so challenging for me. Yeah. Just some really life-changing things that have taken place, that it was almost as I was on autopilot. And by God's grace, yes, he was carrying me through. And I almost felt like I wasn't living into the calling. I was just getting the things checked off the list of to do. And I came to the realization when I was in my recent position at Bear Creek, I served there as director of children and ministries. And honestly, the role is the same as I'm in now. There's no difference. But I remember, I was like, I have one more year. Once I get commissioned, I'll get to it when I get to it. This is what I'm called to do right now. And it wasn't until I lost that position, and then I had other churches calling me and saying, would you like to be a pastor of children and families? And it was like a light bulb went off in my head, and it was like, oh, that's right. This is what I'm called to do. I am a pastor. Why am I waiting for a year from now through commissioning process, which I appreciate and I honor too. But so honestly, that's only been a matter of 2 months and a half. And so that's where I find myself in that sense of like, okay, I am a pastor. I don't, in this capacity, I am serving that. And whatever in the future entails, God will know whether I'm leading a church, a congregation, or I continue in the same role. But I think for me, it's claiming that for myself. And God has been so gracious because every step while He has set it up, there's been a lot of hesitation on my part. And God has just very patiently helped and walked me through it. And I have had to postpone commissioning. This is my 4th year. And the person I was 3-4 years ago, I am no way near that person. And if anything, I feel even more prepared to walk into my role, which I think like for a while there, questioning, okay, why are there so many oppositions? Like, God, are you really calling me to this? Do I need to start thinking about something else? Yeah. And the reality is God has had a plan this whole time. And yes, there's been obstacles, but they've only surfaced to help me claim what God has called me to do.
Yeah. I can't help but think about the Israelites in the wilderness, right? They are released from Egypt. They begin their journey, and then they're at the Red Sea with the Egyptians coming after them. And immediately they're like, what is going on? Why didn't why did we do this? Didn't you hear us tell you, Moses, that we'd be better to stay? And then not only does God pull them through the Red Sea, through this crazy, thing, but then they still several more years in the wilderness. Right. Still, and I often think about that is because they weren't ready to be free. They weren't ready, and I would argue that a whole generation probably had to die off before these people were really ready to embrace their new life that God had for them. And how you could look at why for 4 years, why, and then the things that you've overcome just in the last couple of years, and how it took those, you had to kind of get through those, and now you're able to kind of live into this new space. And like you said, for the first time was like, why am I not ready to claim this? This is who I am. Just like I wonder, like the Israelites, they weren't ready to claim their freedom. They weren't ready to really live into what that means. And so I can see how God has just definitely been working with you in that time, in those delays and that wondering and wondering. And so as you kind of step into this new reality, as you recognize that you've overcome some of those really hard things from the past, and, also step into a new position, what are you going to do to be able to dream about a new life? How are you going to create the space to not only welcome and accept what God's doing for you now, but begin to vision where God might be leading you?
For me, I think it's while I'm called to lead the church, I believe that what church looks like is to be determined in the sense of going to people. And it's different from the deacon's role, right? Because a deacon has been called to the community. But I feel that I've been called to the community as well, not necessarily, of course, always justice and compassion, but not just for that. And the last 4 years ago, when everything just really just got crazy for me, I found myself surrounded with a group of friends who, whether through their own faith, disconnected from church, but not your typical church goers. And I found myself in this circle, and I remember asking God, why? And I needed them at that time because I had gone through a very difficult separation, and we just built these relationships. And what I started to see is a church outside of church, and being that church for people that don't have a church. being someone that they could call upon, and maybe and hopefully not being one of those difficult people from church, but being a liaison between their world, whatever they're encountering, and Christ. And so I think that is where my hope is. Like, God, how does this continue to take place where people can be led to you and you encounter them wherever they are? I am just your vessel to be there and hold out my hand.
Yeah.
So that they can come into a closer relationship with you. And what I have seen over the last, at this point, 4 years is that connection between when there's a low situation or just that bridge.
Yeah.
And I do want to be that.
Yeah.
I do want to be that hope for people that don't, for whatever reason, are not connected to church.
Yeah. What I love about what you said is what I hear is a willingness to dream about a new reality. That maybe from your own experience of self-renewal and self-discovery and living into this current existence that maybe you didn't guess you would be at 4 years ago. It's through that you're able to have the same hope for the church, right? And that maybe there's something new ahead that we don't know about. Again, drawn back to that Exodus story, as they look at the Red Sea and the army behind them, they think there's nothing. The only option is to go back, is to surrender to these slave owners. And yet God had a whole new way, right? Something they never imagined. And I get excited to hear other pastors daring to dream that maybe as we sit at the Red Sea, and we see the army coming after us, and we feel like, there's only two awful options ahead of us, that we could believe and trust that God has a new way. I can't help but also remember that I think it's the Jewish commentary suggests that Moses had to walk into the sea, and it wasn't until it was over his head before the waters began to part. And how scary that must have been, how hard that must have been, that much trust he must have had. But yet, and that's where God began to open a new way. And what might it be like for us if we would continue forward with trust that God is going to do something new? There's something in the Bible about birthing pains, right? It's difficult, it's hard, it's scary, and yet new life is coming. What might that renewal and revival look like for faith communities of all ages and
just
stages?
Hope that there is something more for us, and there's a God who is for us and who's always been there with us, and people need to hear that message.
Yeah. So what next step would you suggest for a leader today who is ready for a new reality, wants to believe it's a possibility? What would be one step you would suggest for them to take?
I think it's stop and look around. Who is your circle? Is your circle mostly made up of churchgoers, Christians? And that's great, that's wonderful. But think about those who are not part of your church circle, and how can they be grafted into, even if it's just through you, a conversation. I think that's real. Otherwise, we're just kind of like sharing the message over and over with ourselves and building each other up, and discipleship and all that is great. But we're called to go to the world with this message and help those who haven't heard it, who haven't committed to a life with Christ. And so that is where my heart is in terms for leaders. Let's not just hone in and get stuck within the walls of our church, but really tap into and not be afraid of that, of what it looks like to be in circles that don't look too churchy.
Yeah. I can't help but think about how many times I'm in a room full of church-going Christians talking about how we're going to reach the people who don't come. And I think, we don't have the answers. We have to talk to those people. We have to talk to them and see what they really need and really want and how they're going to feel communicated to and included. It's like when a bunch of adults decide what's best, what do children want to do?
Right.
You got to ask the kids. You got to involve them, even if it's hard.
Right.
I love that. If people want to connect with you, how can they find you? Where can they build that connection?
Yes, absolutely. Email Susie at christchurchsl.org. I'm also on social media, Instagram and Facebook, Susie Puac. That's Puac.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today. This was really, really wonderful. And I would love to hear from you. Once again, send your comments, your feedback, your questions to sheleadscomments@gmail.com. Love to have you join the conversation. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time. She Leads is produced by me, Thea Curry-Fuson, recorded and edited by Pearland Podcast Studios. All thoughts and expressions shared by the guests are theirs and not the organizations they're affiliated with. Thanks for tuning in. Check us out next week to continue the conversation on She Leads.